I am 75 years old now, and people look at me as if the money came first, as if confidence was something I was born with. But that is not how this story begins. It begins with fear, the quiet, invisible kind, the kind that sits in a child's chest and teaches him very early that the world does not protect the weak, it studies them. And if you are not careful, it breaks you slowly, without ever raising its voice. I remember the first time I understood this. I was standing outside my primary school on the outskirts of London, my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, pretending not to hear the laughter behind me. Martin Collins's voice carried the furthest. It always did. Sharp, confident, certain that no consequence would ever touch him. Peter Wicks laughed beside him, not because the joke was good, but because power loves an audience. I kept walking, head down, back straight. That was my first lesson in survival. Never give them the reaction they want. Pain is loud. Control is silent. At home, the house smelled of oil and fatigue. My father, George Harper, would come back from the factory long after sunset, shoulders curved like he was carrying something heavier than his own body. He was an honest man, too honest. He believed effort was enough. The world punished him for that belief every single day. My mother, Ellen, knew better. She would sit beside me at night, her voice low, almost secretive, and whisper words that felt dangerous just to hear. Edward, the world doesn't remember the hard-working, it remembers the strong. I didn't fully understand her then, but I never forgot it. Fear shaped me, not into a fighter, but into a watcher. I watched how teachers ignored cruelty when it came from the right families. I watched how apologies were demanded from the wrong people. I watched how truth meant nothing without leverage. And somewhere between those observations, a decision formed. Quiet, permanent. I would never beg this world for respect. Not now, not ever. Years passed. I grew thinner, quieter, smarter. When I entered business school, I didn't arrive with confidence. I arrived with preparation. That is where I met Richard Black and Henry Mitchell. Richard spoke like doors opened just because he asked. Henry smiled like rules were suggestions meant for other people. They noticed me because I never competed with them. I listened, I calculated, I filled the gaps they didn't even see. Soon the three of us were inseparable. A perfect balance, they thought. The mind, the voice, the charm. We built our first company from nothing but borrowed desks and dangerous optimism. I worked nights refining systems, projections, structures no one else wanted to touch. Richard handled investors, Henry handled deals. They shook hands, I built foundations. That was another lesson. Visibility creates applause, but invisibility creates control. And for a while it worked. Money began to move, respect followed. I thought, foolishly, that loyalty was part of the equation. The betrayal came quietly. No argument, no warning, just a series of documents signed in rooms I was never invited into. I still remember the moment I found out, sitting alone, reading words that erased years of my life with surgical precision. Shares reassigned, authority removed, my name reduced to a footnote. They had planned it carefully, legally, perfectly. And in that moment, I felt something far worse than anger. I felt foolish. Have you ever realized all at once that everything you trusted was conditional? That the smiles were rehearsed, that the respect was rented? I sat there for a long time staring at the wall, listening to the clock remind me that time doesn't stop for grief. That was when I made another decision. I buried my ego right there. No confrontation, no revenge fantasies, just a promise to myself this would never happen again. I rebuilt alone, failed, rebuilt again, failed better. Each failure taught me something specific.
Each success taught me something dangerous. I stopped chasing recognition. I started studying systems, businesses that didn't need applause, money that didn't need permission, power that didn't announce itself. And all the while, I watched Richard and Henry from a distance. Their empire grew fast, too fast, built on confidence, not caution. Time passed, years slipped by, and somewhere in the background something began to shift. Small things at first, delayed deals, nervous investors, subtle cracks. They didn't notice me. Why would they? To them I was history, a solved problem. But I was learning the most important lesson of all. Revenge doesn't need speed, it needs timing. So I waited. And as I waited, I asked myself a question I want you to consider too. If the people who broke you never apologized, never looked back, never felt regret, what would justice look like then? Because in that silence, in that waiting, the real story was only just beginning.
Some wounds don't bleed, they ferment, quietly, day after day. That was what happened to me after I was pushed out of my own company. I didn't disappear. I didn't collapse. I recalibrated. On the surface, I looked like a man starting over. Inside, a clock had started ticking. Every second reminded me of something important. Time was no longer my enemy. Time was going to be my weapon. I ask myself a question most people avoid because they're afraid of the answer. Was I defeated, or was I simply removed from the board too early? I chose patience. I rebuilt slowly, deliberately, without attaching my name to anything loud or impressive. This time, I didn't chase growth. I studied structure. I created small ventures no one talked about, businesses that didn't need headlines to survive. I learned to love numbers, to respect risk instead of fearing it, and above all, I learned silence. Silence isn't emptiness. Silence is observation without interference. At night, I worked until exhaustion dulled the memories, but sometimes, without warning, the past crept back in. Richard's confident laugh, Henry's hand on my shoulder, the false reassurance. What once felt like brotherhood now felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. The anger was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer wild. It was controlled, focused, dangerous. From a distance, I began to watch them. Richard had grown bolder, too bold. He confused momentum with immunity. Henry still smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. Their company expanded rapidly, but expansion without discipline is just speed towards collapse. The foundations were thin, over-leveraged, dependent on confidence rather than contingency. Have you ever watched a building fail? It never collapses all at once. First, there are sounds only the quiet can hear. I began investing again, but never in my own name. Visibility had cost me everything once. I wasn't going to repeat that mistake. I placed capital where their business depended most: supply chains, secondary vendors, financial intermediaries. Every industry has pressure points. You don't need to attack the tower when you can weaken the ground beneath it. That was when I met Samuel Riches, an old investor, calm, analytical, a man who spoke less than he knew. We never discussed revenge. We discussed opportunity. He understood immediately. Some men don't need explanations. They only need data. We aligned without promises, without emotion, just mathematics and timing. Then I made another move, a subtle one. I began supporting people Richard and Henry openly dismissed, men they laughed at in meetings, entrepreneurs they considered irrelevant. Daniel Foster was one of them, young, sharp, underestimated. I didn't give him money blindly. I gave him systems, access, strategy. Richard laughed, Henry mocked, and I documented everything.
Confidence can be intoxicating. When success comes easily, discipline feels unnecessary. That was their mistake. Banks started asking questions. Investors began hesitating. Margins tightened. Decisions that once seemed small now carried consequences. Time was accelerating, and they didn't feel it. There were moments, late at night, when doubt whispered. I could have warned them. I could have stepped forward, revealed what I knew, altered the outcome. But then another question surfaced. When they erased me, did they warn me? Did they hesitate? That was when I fully understood something vital. Revenge isn't loud. Revenge doesn't announce itself. Real revenge is invisible until it's irreversible. I stripped impatience out of my system. I trained myself to wait, to let others create their own downfall. One evening, I stood by my window watching the city lights flicker like distant signals. Every light represented a decision someone had made. Every shadow hid a consequence waiting to emerge. I knew the ending was coming, but not yet. Endings require precision. I smiled to myself, because this time I wasn't reacting to the game. I was designing it. So let me ask you something. If you knew your enemy was walking confidently towards his own mistake, would you stop him, or would you simply step aside and let the gravity do the rest? I chose to wait.
By the time people noticed my name again, it was already too late to place it properly. That was intentional. I had learned that recognition, when it comes too early, becomes a liability. So I stayed where power prefers to live, behind patterns, behind decisions that looked unrelated, behind silence that made other people underestimate the room. This was the phase where psychology mattered more than money. Richard and Henry were not stupid men. That is important to understand. They were confident, experienced, and surrounded by advisors who told them exactly what they wanted to hear. But confidence has a weakness. It resists doubt. And doubt was the only thing I needed to introduce, slowly, carefully, like a hairline fracture in glass. Their meetings became louder. I knew this because people talk when they're nervous, and nervous people always talk to the wrong ones. A banker mentioned tension. A consultant hinted at internal disagreement. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough noise to tell me pressure was building inside the walls. I remained calm. Inside my own ventures, everything ran quietly. Systems executed. Cash flowed without emotion. I didn't chase growth, I allowed it. That difference matters. Growth that is chased demands constant attention. Growth that is designed sustains itself. I had learned to remove myself from operations. If something collapsed because I wasn't present, it meant I had built it wrong. Late one night, I received a call I had been expecting for months. A junior executive from one of their partner firms. His voice was hesitant. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He only confirmed what I already knew. The numbers no longer matched the confidence. Forecasts were being adjusted. Risks were being reframed as temporary fluctuations. Have you ever noticed how language changes right before failure? I didn't react. I thanked him, hung up, and made a note. Daniel Foster came to see me shortly after. He was tense, focused. He had been growing faster than expected, and with growth came attention, the wrong kind. Richard's team had started circling him, asking questions disguised as compliments. Daniel asked me what to do. I told him nothing specific. Instead, I asked him a question. What happens if you grow too fast? He answered honestly, you lose control. I nodded. He understood. He slowed down. That decision would later save him everything. Meanwhile, Richard did the opposite. He accelerated, more leverage, more exposure, more public confidence. Henry tried to moderate, but moderation looks like weakness when arrogance is winning. Their conversations became fragmented. Their alignment cracked. I didn't cause that. I simply allowed it. And then came the encounter. It happened at a conference. Neutral ground, polite smiles. A coincidence that wasn't accidental. Richard spotted me across the room.
His expression shifted just for a second, surprise, then control. He approached confidently, hand extended, voice warm. "Edward," he said, "didn't expect to see you here." I shook his hand, firm, calm, measured. "Neither did I replied. We exchanged pleasantries. He spoke about expansion, about momentum, about the future. I listened. I always listened. Henry joined us, smiling as if nothing had ever happened, as if history could be rewritten through tone alone. They asked what I was working on. I told them the truth, without detail. "Small things," I said. "I prefer stability." They laughed, gently, condescendingly, the same laughter from years ago, the same mistake. As they walked away, Richard said something that stayed with me. "You were always cautious, Edward. Some people just aren't built for big risk." He was right. I wasn't built for reckless risk. I was built for inevitable outcomes. That night, alone in my hotel room, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. They still didn't see me. They still believed power announced itself. That belief was about to cost them everything. Behind the scenes, banks adjusted terms, quietly. Investors requested additional assurances. Delays appeared where speed once lived. None of it dramatic enough to trigger panic, just enough to create friction. Time tightened. I could feel it, that subtle shift when momentum turns from ally to burden, when growth demands feeding instead of rewarding patience. I had lived through it once. I recognized the signs. So I prepared the final framework. Not the strike, not yet. The containment, the conditions. I ensured that when collapse came, it would have only one soft landing available. Mine. I asked myself one last question before moving forward. When the moment arrives, will I destroy them, or will I own the space they fall into? Because revenge, I had learned, is not about punishment. It's about positioning. And now the board was set.
By the time the first cracks became visible, it was almost imperceptible to anyone outside the inner circle. To the world, Richard and Henry were still untouchable. Their offices gleamed, their clients smiled, and the media celebrated their growth. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. A slow, quiet erosion that no public headline could capture. And I was watching it all, not from the shadows, but from a calculated distance, where every move they made could be anticipated, every mistake measured, every misstep catalogued. I had spent years learning patience, and now it was paying off. Deals began to fall apart, not because of luck, not because of chance, but because systems that appear flawless often hide vulnerabilities. A supplier delayed shipments, a bank subtly raised its terms, cash flow tightened in ways that looked like coincidence, yet were consequences of quiet pressure points I had set in motion long before. Every delay, every hesitation, every phone call that ended abruptly was a whisper of inevitability. It was in these quiet moments that the thrill of strategy became almost intoxicating. I wasn't cheering for their failure, not really. I was orchestrating a balance, tipping scales that had been skewed by arrogance and oversight. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous men are those who believe they are untouchable. And Richard and Henry had perfected that illusion. But illusions have edges, and those edges can cut. Meanwhile, I continued to reinforce my own empire. Daniel Foster's company thrived quietly under my guidance. He grew faster than anyone suspected, yet with discipline, and no one suspected my involvement. Every small victory on his side created invisible pressure on my former partners. Competitors began whispering, investors grew cautious, and the slightest misstep was amplified by their own overconfidence. They were drowning slowly in a pool they didn't even realize they had entered. One evening, I received a call from a mutual contact, a legal advisor who had once worked with them. He didn't know me personally, yet his tone betrayed urgency. "Things are shifting," he said. "They're trying to restructure, but the banks, the investors, there's resistance." No one needed to know more. I already knew the internal dominoes had begun to fall. I didn't respond with advice or guidance. I simply made a note, filed it, and let time continue its work. It was also during this period that I noticed their psychology fracturing.
Henry, once calm and composed, began micromanaging. Every minor decision became a boardroom debate. Richard, the confident visionary, started second-guessing even the simplest deals. Small arguments, minor tensions, once inconsequential, now escalated rapidly. Power, when tested silently over time, exposes character flaws. I had studied them long enough to know which weaknesses to leave alone and which to subtly influence. The most fascinating part was watching them trust the wrong people. They sought advice from those who reassured them instead of those who questioned them. I had learned early in life that the loudest voices rarely tell the truth, the quietest ones do. And in this case, the quietest ones were already aligned with me. Their overconfidence created a perfect trap. They were building my victory with their own hands. Yet I remained careful. I did not celebrate, I did not interfere overtly. I simply positioned resources, monitored responses, and ensured every shift worked in my favor. Revenge, I had learned, is most potent when it feels invisible to the victim. It is surgical, not chaotic. One night, as I reviewed reports from multiple industries, some connected directly to them, some indirectly, I allowed myself a small private smile. Patterns emerged. A single mismanaged contract here, a delayed payment there, a minor leadership conflict that had been ignored for months, all converging into a pressure point strong enough to destabilize even the most confident empire. And when it finally collapsed, they would have no one to blame but themselves. I often reflected on those early lessons from my mother. Edward, the world doesn't remember the hard-working, it remembers the strong. At the time, I thought strength was visible, physical, or loud, but now I understood. True strength is quiet, calculated, patient, and when it strikes, it leaves no doubt of who wields it. By now, I could see it, the moment approaching when their empire would wobble visibly. I didn't need to rush, I didn't need to make it dramatic. I had already learned that timing is more terrifying than fury. When the cracks finally widened, there would be no escape. Not because I was loud or vengeful, but because I had waited for the perfect conditions. And that is the difference between revenge and destruction. Destruction screams, revenge whispers until it is unstoppable. I leaned back in my chair that night, the city lights casting long shadows across my office. I asked myself quietly, when the fall comes, will they recognize it? Or will they still believe the world is kind, the world fair, the world oblivious? They won't recognize it. Not yet. And that, I knew, was the most satisfying part of all.
By the time the cracks became undeniable, it was already too late for Richard and Henry to recover. Their empire, once untouchable in the eyes of outsiders, was faltering. Banks had tightened terms, investors hesitated, and minor partnerships began to collapse. It was subtle, so subtle that their staff still smiled in meetings and clients continued to shake hands with confidence, but underneath it all, pressure had reached a breaking point, and I had orchestrated it, quietly, methodically, without a single dramatic move. I watched from the sidelines as their overconfidence became their enemy. Richard made hasty decisions. He leveraged more debt. He expanded too quickly into new markets. Henry tried to maintain calm, but his attempts only exposed more fractures. Arguments that would have been minor months ago now escalated into major disputes. Leadership was crumbling under its own weight, and I didn't interfere. I let it happen, let the system I had set in motion do its work. Meanwhile, my investments, carefully placed over years, began to pay off. Daniel Foster's ventures had matured quietly. Investors trusted him. Supply chains thrived. The companies I had backed were stable and growing. Every success on that front added invisible pressure to Richard and Henry. Their missteps looked bigger because someone else's victories were proving them wrong. Every delay in their cash flow, every missed opportunity, every nervous glance in board meetings, all of it was amplified by comparison to the disciplined, calculated progress happening elsewhere. Then came the moment I had waited for. A key deal collapsed.
something that should have been seamless. Panic subtly spread across their offices. Investors demanded explanations. Partners questioned decisions. A ripple effect followed that no amount of confident smiling could contain. I did not gloat. I did not call. I simply observed. Their own actions, their own arrogance had done the work I had planned years ago. It was fascinating, almost poetic, to witness the transformation of men I once called friends. The same faces that once smiled with certainty now carried tension and doubt. Decisions that had once seemed easy were now agonizing. They began to grasp, finally, that success without control is a house of cards, and their house was collapsing quietly, step by step. I had spent years preparing for this. I had learned patience, timing, and leverage, and now it was paying off in the most powerful way possible. Because revenge isn't about screaming, it isn't about destruction, it's about creating conditions so precise that the victim destroys himself without realizing who set the stage. I reached out finally, not to humiliate, not to punish, but to guide the next step. Their company was failing, yes, but it was salvageable under the right leadership, and I was that leadership. I offered terms, strategic, precise, beneficial, but with conditions that ensured control rested where it should, with me. Richard and Henry, desperate to preserve even a fraction of what they had built, agreed without hesitation. Their need blinded them, and I didn't hide it. I didn't need to. They had already set themselves up. Sitting in the boardroom as their company was transferred under my management, I noticed something remarkable. The men who had once controlled me now worked in the same building where my name was on the door. Edward Harper, chairman. Their pride, their arrogance had led them here. They had built their own downfall without ever realizing it. And yet I chose mercy. Not because I was kind, but because restraint amplifies power. I could have destroyed everything. I could have humiliated them publicly, but the greatest revenge is success, so complete that your enemies are forced to acknowledge it, forced to respect it, forced to call you sir. I often reflect on that period now, years of waiting, calculating, building silently, and allowing others to stumble into the trap I set. The lesson is clear. Power is earned quietly. Revenge is measured. Time is your ally if you respect it. And patience, ruthless patience, is the single most dangerous tool you can wield. By now, I had not only reclaimed what was mine, I had surpassed it. My fortune, built on systems and foresight, now dwarfed what they had once flaunted. And the satisfaction, the quiet, unwavering satisfaction, was indescribable. The world saw a billionaire. My former partners saw a man who had been wronged and had waited. And in that silence, in that invisible victory, I realized something essential. Revenge is not destruction. Revenge is inevitability. And when executed with precision, it leaves no scars on the victor, only on the pride and miscalculations of those who underestimated him. I sat in my office that night, lights of the city sprawling endlessly below. I could have celebrated, I could have made noise, but true victory, I understood, is calm, composed, and complete. It doesn't need applause, it doesn't need recognition, it simply exists, undeniable, irreversible, and perfectly timed. Because the most powerful revenge is this: to succeed so completely that your enemies have no choice but to acknowledge your dominance, and the lesson they once ignored becomes undeniable. And that, I thought, is the ultimate justice.
By the time I fully took control, everything was in place. The empire I had once built alongside Richard and Henry was now mine, not through brute force, not through loud confrontation, but through patience, precision, and foresight. They worked under me now, in the very building where my name stood at the top. Edward Harper, chairman. A detail that once would have thrilled me with immediate satisfaction now only gave a quiet, almost imperceptible thrill. Because the real victory isn't loud, it's enduring, it's irreversible. I watched them adjust to their new reality. Confidence turned into careful calculation, arrogance into cautious strategy. They were still competent men, but now they had to play by my rules. Every move they made reminded them of the lesson they had once ignored. Power is not given, it is taken, and it is retained only by those who understand its full cost. I often think back to the child I once was, standing outside that London school, hands buried deep in coat pockets, pretending not to notice the laughter behind me. I was quiet, weak, powerless, but I learned then what would guide my life forever: endurance, patience, and observation. The world doesn't care who works hardest. It doesn't care who is honest. It remembers the strong. And now, at 75, I understood that strength fully. It is not muscle or loudness. It is clarity of thought. It is discipline of action. And it is the ability to see the long game while everyone else is blinded by the immediate. I did not build my fortune out of revenge alone. I built it from knowledge, from foresight, from systems that could survive without me. But revenge shaped me. It taught me restraint. It taught me to wait for the perfect moment, to understand timing, leverage, and the subtle power of silence. The betrayal I suffered decades ago became the greatest education of my life, not in bitterness, but in mastery. Richard and Henry eventually came to accept their position. Not with gratitude, not with apology, but with acknowledgement. And that was enough. The satisfaction of revenge is not in seeing someone fall, it is in witnessing inevitability. When your enemies are forced to recognize your power, not through anger, not through force, but because they see it in every outcome, in every system, in every decision that succeeds where theirs fails, that is the highest justice. And then, quietly, life returned to its rhythm. I oversaw my ventures, continued to guide Daniel Foster and other allies, and ensured that the structures I had built remained strong. Yet in the evenings, I would sometimes sit alone, reflecting on the journey. The fear of childhood, the lessons of betrayal, the discipline forged through adversity, all of it converged into understanding. True power is patient, calculated, and enduring. Revenge is not a shout, it is a quiet, unstoppable force. I share this because perhaps someone listening now has felt that same fear, that same injustice, that same helplessness. And I want you to understand this. The path to true mastery is not immediate action or rash retaliation. It is preparation, observation, precision. It is knowing that when the moment finally arrives, you will not need to fight. You will simply step into inevitability. Today, I am a billionaire, yes. But more importantly, I am a man who has lived long enough to see the lessons of life, betrayal, and patience converge into clarity. I have learned that success, properly timed, is the most complete form of revenge. Not destruction, not humiliation, but dominance that others cannot ignore. The kind of power that earns respect without demanding it and forces acknowledgement without argument. So remember this, the world will test you. It will betray you. It will challenge you in ways that seem unbearable. But the most important lesson is this: patience, discipline, and observation will always outlast anger and impulsivity. Power grows silently, unnoticed, until one day it cannot be ignored. And when that day arrives, justice, clarity, and success will all arrive at once. For me, that day came long after betrayal. It came after decades of preparation, and when it arrived, it was perfect. Not because I wanted vengeance, but because I understood it, and the world finally had no choice but to acknowledge it. Edward Harper, 75 years old, billionaire, survivor, master of patience, timing, and the quiet art of true revenge.